The most powerful weapon America built after World War II was not a bomb. It was an office. It had no tanks. No battleships. No public army marching under its own flag. But behind one law, one directive, and one quiet budget clause, the United States created something it had never possessed in peacetime before, a permanent intelligence service with the authority to see in secret, spend in secret, and act in secret. The public heard the language of national security. Coordination. Efficiency. Lessons learned from war. Inside Washington, the calculation was darker. The next war might not begin with an invasion. It might begin with a strike in Berlin, a communist victory in Rome, a coup in a capital most Americans could not find on a map, or a message intercepted too late. The old system, divided between the Army, Navy, State Department, and FBI, had failed to give one clear warning before Pearl Harbor. Now the men around President Harry Truman believed the world was entering a struggle where warning itself was not enough. They wanted an instrument that could operate before the shooting started. That was the secret at the center of the decision. In 1945, the war ended, and America tried to become normal again. Soldiers came home. Factories changed over. The Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence organization built by William Donovan, was dissolved by Truman in September. To many Americans, that seemed natural. The United States had always distrusted permanent secret services. They belonged to empires, police states, and old European games. But the war had changed the men who had fought it. They had seen codes broken, resistance networks armed, propaganda shaped, scientists hunted, and enemy plans uncovered in rooms where no uniform was visible. Intelligence had not been an accessory to power. It had become power. And then the map began to harden. Soviet influence spread across Eastern Europe. In Greece and Turkey, Washington feared collapse under pressure from Moscow. In Germany, the ruins of the Nazi state became the front line of a new contest. In Italy and France, communist parties carried real political weight. In Asia, civil war and revolution were rewriting the future faster than diplomats could describe it. The American government was not blind. It was worse than blind. It was fragmented. The Army had information. The Navy had information. The State Department had reports. The FBI guarded its domestic empire. Each office protected its channels, its budgets, its pride, and its secrets. Intelligence moved through Washington like smoke through locked rooms. Truman wanted a daily summary on his desk. He wanted someone to connect the pieces. He did not want another Pearl Harbor, another morning when the country discovered that signs had existed, but no one had put them together in time. So in January 1946, he created the Central Intelligence Group, a temporary structure meant to coordinate intelligence under the National Intelligence Authority. It was not yet the CIA. It was a bridge, an experiment, a compromise between agencies that did not want to be controlled. But temporary structures have a way of revealing permanent desires. The men building the new system quickly understood that coordination alone would never satisfy the demands of the Cold War. Reports could tell the president what was happening. They could not change what was happening. And in Washington, by 1947, the question was no longer only how to know the world. The question was how to move it. On July 26, 1947, Truman signed the National Security Act aboard the presidential aircraft Sacred Cow. The image was almost quiet, a president, a document, a signature. But the law reorganized the machinery of American power. It created the National Security Council. It created the National Military Establishment, later the Department of Defense. It created an independent Air Force. And under the direction of the National Security Council, it established the Central Intelligence Agency. The public language was careful. The CIA would advise the National Security Council. It would correlate and evaluate intelligence. It would perform services of common concern. It would protect sources and methods. And then came the phrase that mattered most, the opening through which the future would pass. The agency would perform such other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security as the National Security Council might direct. It sounded like bureaucracy. It was a loaded door. That sentence did not announce coups, propaganda campaigns, secret armies, or political warfare. It did not need to. It created a space where those things could later be authorized without building a new institution in public. The power was not fully visible in the law itself. It was hidden in the relationship between the CIA and the National Security Council, between secrecy and presidential authority, between vague language and urgent fear. And fear was everywhere. By late 1947, the Truman Doctrine had declared support for countries resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressure. The Marshall Plan was moving toward Europe. Washington saw the Soviet Union not merely as a rival, but as a system testing every weak point in the post-war order. The question inside closed rooms became simple and dangerous. If Moscow could use parties, unions, newspapers, front groups, money, intimidation, and covert channels, could the United States afford to answer only in public? George Kennan, the State Department strategist famous for containment, understood that power had a visible face and an invisible one. In 1948, as anxiety sharpened over Europe, Washington moved beyond intelligence collection into organized political warfare. The decisive paper was NSC 10-2, approved in June 1948. This was the moment the office became an instrument. NSC 10 has established a covert operations capability inside the CIA, first under the name Office of Special Projects, soon renamed the Office of Policy Coordination. Its mission was not simply to gather secrets. It was to conduct operations so planned and executed that United States government responsibility would not be evident, and if exposed, could be plausibly denied. There it was. The doctrine of hidden power, written in the language of administration. Plausible denial was more than a legal shield. It was a political technology. It allowed a democracy to act in the shadows while preserving the appearance of distance. It allowed presidents to authorize pressure without public ownership. It allowed Washington to influence events abroad while keeping the official story clean enough to survive a press conference. But a secret order still needed a machine. The Office of Policy Coordination grew under Frank Wisner, a brilliant and intense former OSS officer who believed the Cold War would be fought in the minds, parties, newspapers, and underground networks of other nations. OPC was placed inside the CIA, but its policy guidance involved the State and Defense Departments. That awkward arrangement was intentional. It gave the new office proximity to intelligence, connection to foreign policy, and enough ambiguity for everyone to use it while arguing over who truly controlled it. This ambiguity was not a defect. It was part of the design. The first great test came in Italy in 1948. A communist electoral victory seemed possible. The United States feared that Italy, still bruised by war and poverty, could drift into the Soviet orbit through ballots rather than tanks. Money, propaganda, private channels, and political support moved through hidden networks. The exact boundaries of the effort remained debated in parts, but the direction is clear. Washington had learned that covert action could be used not only to observe history, but to bend it. What the public saw was an election. What Washington saw was a battlefield without uniforms. The success, or perceived success, of early covert political action created its own momentum. Once a secret instrument appears to work, it becomes difficult for leaders to put it away. Each crisis creates an argument for the next operation. Each operation creates personnel, contacts, habits, and budgets. Soon the question is not whether the instrument should exist. The question becomes where else it can be used. Still, power requires money. And money leaves trails. That was the problem the CIA Act of 1949 helped solve. Signed into law on June 20, 1949, it gave the agency administrative authorities that made secrecy practical. The CIA could transfer and receive funds from other government agencies. It could spend money without the same public accounting requirements imposed on ordinary departments. It could protect the names, titles, salaries, and functions of its personnel. It could move people and resources through channels built for concealment. This was not cinematic power. It was accounting power. And accounting power may be the most durable kind. A secret operation is not only a dramatic meeting or a coded message. It is travel paperwork, cover employment, safe houses, salaries, front organizations, communications equipment, subsidies, and invoices that cannot read like invoices. The 1949 law gave the young agency the ability to function like a hidden state inside the state, with enough legal room to pay for things that could not be explained in public. That is when the CIA stopped being merely a new intelligence agency and began becoming a permanent architecture of covert American power. The transformation did not happen all at once. It was built by law, directive, fear, personality, and crisis. Truman had wanted coordinated intelligence, and he later expressed discomfort with how far the agency moved into peacetime operations. But institutions rarely remain inside the intentions of the people who sign them into existence. They respond to pressure. They grow around opportunities. They learn the habits that bring them closer to the center of decision. By 1950, war in Korea confirmed the sense that the Cold War could turn hot without warning. The demand for intelligence and covert capability expanded. Under Walter Bedell Smith, the CIA became more disciplined, more centralized, and more deeply woven into national security planning. The old separation between information and action narrowed. Reports fed operations. Operations produced new intelligence. Intelligence justified more operations. The loop had begun. Behind the official map of American government, another map was forming: stations, assets, cutouts, front groups, liaison channels, classified budgets, and committees that could approve decisions most citizens would never know had been considered. This was the hidden consequence of 1947, 1948, and 1949. The United States did not simply create an agency. It created a method for fighting in the gray zone between peace and war. The method would later appear in Iran, Guatemala, Tibet, Cuba, Congo, Laos, Chile, Afghanistan, and many other places, sometimes with short-term success, sometimes with disastrous consequences, often with moral costs that outlived the operation itself. But at the beginning, the men in the room were not thinking in the language of future scandal. They were thinking in the language of survival. They believed the Soviet system was already fighting by invisible means. They believed open democracies were vulnerable to hidden pressure. They believed the next catastrophe would punish hesitation. And because they believed those things, they accepted a dangerous idea, that secrecy could defend freedom if it was controlled by the right people, in the right rooms, for the right reasons. That belief was the real decision. Not the signature alone. Not the office name. Not the seal on the wall. The decision was to make deniable power a normal tool of policy. Once that happened, American presidents inherited more than an intelligence service. They inherited an option. When diplomacy was too slow, when war was too costly, when public action was too dangerous, there was another path. Quiet money. Quiet pressure. Quiet influence. Quiet force. And because it was quiet, it was tempting. The story of the CIA's rise is often told through famous operations, famous directors, and famous failures. But the deeper story begins before the mythology, before the sunglasses and dead drops, before the coups and committee hearings. It begins with a state trying to adapt to a world it no longer trusted. It begins with men who feared surprise so much that they built an institution designed to surprise others first. There is a reason the decision still matters. Modern power often hides behind process. It does not always announce itself with speeches or tanks in the street. Sometimes it appears as a clause in a law, a directive with a number, a budget authority, a committee name, a phrase broad enough to hold a future no one will fully explain. The world sees the public decision. History often turns on the private permission. In 1947, the United States opened the door. In 1948, it gave the room a mission. In 1949, it gave the mission a wallet no ordinary citizen could inspect. After that, the question was no longer whether America would have a secret service. The question was how much of the century would be shaped by things done in its name, in rooms most people would never enter, under orders they would never read, for reasons they would only learn years later, if they learned them at all. The most powerful weapon was not the office. It was the silence around it.